Okay, I need first to give a quick context on the role of GPs in the healthcare system, in the UK at least. Basically, GP is like the central data system place of all medical records of a patient. Alright, let's dive into what does a GP pharmacist do. Mainly, it's calling patients to talk about their medications, discharge letters and updating them onto the system, medication reviews, clinical audits, and clinics for long-term conditions. I had the chance to do those things in my GP pharmacy placement as well, under the supervision of a pharmacist. And on a daily basis, the pharmacist has call appointments with patients who has inquiries or issues about their medication regimen, and the pharmacist will make any appropriate amendments accordingly. And in a world of no COVID-19, these will be face-to-face. So in between the calls, when there is quote-unquote free time, the pharmacist will look at discharge letters from hospitals and update these onto the patient's medical records. So, quickly on what are discharge letters. When a patient is admitted to hospital and is then well enough to go home, a discharge letter will be produced to talk about what has happened and also the medications that the patient has taken or needs to start taking after the hospital admission. This is one of the most important tasks to do as a GP pharmacist because there may be amendments to a patient's medication regimen, and for this, usually it is done by a pharmacy technician first and then a pharmacist for a second round of checks for accuracy and any additional clinical checks, just to make sure that what is done in the hospital is clinically appropriate too. Next are medication reviews. It is basically checking that medications a patient are currently on are still suitable for them, and this is usually done annually for each patient. Next up are clinical audits. To contextualize this better, I will give some examples of what I did in the 3 weeks that I'm at in Gilbray Medical Practice, Dumfries. So patients who are on triple whammy combination of drugs, and yes, I find it to be a fun name too, which are an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor or ACE inhibitor or angiotensin receptor blocker ARB, plus a diuretic, plus a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug NSAIDs, they are at a great increased risk of acute kidney injury, which basically means that these drugs really dries up the kidney. And therefore, I've been involved in checking patients who are taking this medication combination and, where appropriate, call patients to talk about these drugs and make clinical amendments. For example, switching the NSAID, which is 9 out of 10 times prescribed because for pain relief, switching it to paracetamol or codeine. So other clinical audit examples that I did during my GP placement in Dumfries is looking at patients who are more than 75 years old and on an NSAID, for example ibuprofen or naproxen, etc., without a tummy protecting medication. So, being more than 75 years old and maybe experiencing some muscle aches, joint pain, or osteoarthritis will potentially be taking an NSAID, and unfortunately this increases the risk of a stomach bleed due to their age. So we always think of in terms of risk versus benefits. Of course, some patients have no choice but to take the NSAID to manage the condition, but then it comes with a risk of a stomach bleed, and hence a tummy protecting medication called a proton pump inhibitor, for example omeprazole, needs to be prescribed. And for patients who needs to be on a tummy protecting medication are patients who are more than 65 years old on an antiplatelet and NSAID. They need to be on this tummy protecting medication as well, because this combination of drugs and age increases the risk of stomach bleed. And another example is if the patient is on an oral anticoagulant, an NSAID, and then no stomach protection medication. Oh, and remember, if the patient is on clopidogrel, which is an antiplatelet, and needs a proton pump inhibitor, other words PPI, please give them lansoprazole instead of omeprazole, okay? This is because clopidogrel interacts with omeprazole, so we need to use lansoprazole instead. Next will be clinics for chronic conditions. So I did not have the opportunity to see how this works during my placement, but it's basically something like pharmacists will be involved in making sure patients are managing their long-term disease state well. So for example, like asthma clinics, so asking about a patient's inhaler techniques, things like that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the importance of pharmacists in GP practices. So it is important because we monitor closely high-risk prescribing, which are like examples that I've mentioned just now, the triple whammy combination drugs, which is the ACE or ARB plus diuretic plus NSAIDs. So this is to keep the patient as healthy as possible, and this can reduce hospital admissions. So reduced hospital admissions also does reduce the cost on the healthcare system, and also the concept of fair distribution of scarce medical resources. So pharmacists will be making sure that the GP prescribes the cheapest medication option, and obviously not at the expense of the patient's health. So basically, if you have two of the same thing and one is cheaper than the other, obviously choose the cheaper one, right? But of course, this is always secondary to patient safety and care. So if something is cheaper but not therapeutically effective or causes more side effects, it will obviously not be the way to go, okay? So you got the disease, you got the medication, you just match them up together. End of story. Simple. No. Okay, unfortunately, that is not the case. When a patient has multiple conditions, they'll be taking a lot of medications to manage them, and they can interact with each other. And sometimes doctors are not aware of this. For example, the triple whammy combination of drugs that I mentioned. And do not go about shaming doctors saying, oh my god, why doctors don't know things like this? I would say that doctors are the better experts at the diagnosis of a disease and then matching the medication to the diagnosis. And then pharmacists are better at the management of a disease, because management involves medications, and we know the medications best. We know what will interact with what. And humans can only know so much things, and therefore the importance of the concept of working in a multidisciplinary team to offer the best patient care possible. So what I like about GP pharmacy, I like the fact that it involves a lot of thinking of how to manage a patient's condition through medications, looking at their medication regimen, making sure that the medications that the patient is taking is appropriate for the condition that they have. I like as well that in the GP, we get to see a patient's complete medical history from every single hospital admission the patient have had, which is all the discharge letters, to every single lab reports of a patient. So this allows me to understand a patient's complete medical history, and this is not really the case in hospital. And well, when a patient is admitted to hospital, yes, we are able to pull in patient's medical records from the GP, but it is not always the full picture. So that is about it. There is a possibility of different GPs operating differently, and therefore do comment down below if you have had a different experience when working with a GP pharmacist, as I'd like to know more as well. Also, any thoughts or opinions that you may have, comment down below, as I hope that this video can create like various conversations within the comments and hopefully help someone to better understand about GP pharmacy. And after a 30-minute walk, I finally reached Gilbray Medical Practice. So it's time to continue checking on my triple whammy patients, and I look forward to that. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for watching. I hope this video helped you. Bye!
Morning.